Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. South Africa is increasingly been at the center of headlines. Now, it's making history as the first African country to hold the G20 presidency, yet its leadership of the bloc has already been overshadowed by its increasingly strained relations with the US. At the same time, South Africa has taken bold positions on major global issues, from its strong advocacy for Palestinian rights to its legal challenge against Israel at the International Court of Justice. And it continues to navigate its place in BRICS, which is increasingly seen as a counterweight to Western-led economic institutions. So what does this all say about South Africa's global standing, and what does it reveal about the shifting world order? Well, joining me on the show today to help unpack all of this is Ismail Lahardin, who is a columnist, essayist, and author who writes extensively on global political and economic affairs. He is South African born with Malay heritage, and he's here in Malaysia writing his latest book. So Ismail, thank you so much for being on the show with me. I was hoping you could begin our conversation maybe setting a bit of context first. Right. When I mentioned in the intro that South Africa is, creating history as the first African country to hold the G20 presidency, what does it mean in terms of this historic, presidency for the African continent? What does it mean to hold that for all G20 countries, or all the countries involved in the G20 bloc?
Well, thanks. South Africa was one of the founding members of the G20 in 1999. Our minister at the time, finance minister, was Trevor Emmanuel, the country's most successful finance minister in its history. So South Africa has played a role in that, a very important role. That the presidency of the G20 has come to South Africa is unsurprising, but it is important at two levels. One is just for African leadership and to showcase that we are, in the global South. That we can and we do in fact lead. And then at the global level, it is an opportunity for countries of the global South. And here, we should sort of bleed or create this Venn diagram with the BRICS countries and the G20. And so it gives the countries of the global South an opportunity to move towards being rule makers in global political economic issues, as opposed to being rule takers. Because we are in this interregnum where the 500 years of Western European capitalism is coming to an end. We just don't know when. It could be in another couple of decades, and with the East rising. So we're in this sort of liminal space. We don't quite know where we are. And it is this point where it becomes important for countries of the global South, including Malaysia and South Africa, to start taking leadership. And that is why it's especially significant that South Africa's president is not South Africa's president is holding the presidency of the G20 at about the same time that Malaysia is becoming part of the BRICS. Right, and at the same year, Malaysia is holding the ASEAN chair. I feel such similarities between the two countries. But I want to ask you how the US factors into it, because it's kind of throw a spanner in the works. The increasingly strained relationship between the US and South Africa, and this is largely because President Donald Trump is very mad at South Africa for its position on Israel, on Palestine, and its land reform policies. Talk to me a little bit about that, about how you've seen the relationship between the two countries change and evolve under his presidency. And I hate to say this, but in fairness to Donald Trump, he is not as upset with South Africa over the International Court of Justice decision. It's a hangover mainly from the Biden administration, but he has continued it, and he's added onto it several other things. The big thing, there's a very small group of Afrikaners in South Africa. Now, the Afrikaners are the people, is the minority within the minority, sort of. They were never more than 9 or 8% of the country, but they governed the country for 350 years.
They are predominantly wealthy white
people. But there's there's a minority within that minority who claim there's a genocide on against them. Now, this idea of a genocide, they're playing very loose and fast with this term, because if you look at the statistics, this Afrikaner community owns the vast majority of the land and the farms and agriculture. So over a weekend, there might be 2 what they call farm attacks. So 2 people on a farm killed, but they happen to be white. But at the same time, across the country, there are 300 people, black people, who've been killed. But then they paint the 2 attacks on the white people as part of a white genocide. So the statistics don't match up. So what they've done is they've gone into this, because of the loss of power of this Afrikaner minority, they feel that loss of power is now becoming they're having difficulty dealing with it. So they're claiming that they're an oppressed minority. When the point basically is that, you know, one of the things I discovered when I visited this time Malaysia is there's a slight similarity. Let me go back to South Africa. When I was at school, we were taught that the history of South Africa began with the arrival of the white man. And now what we're trying to do is to say that there's more to the history of the white man in South Africa. We were forced to learn English and Afrikaans, these languages derived from Europe. But though Afrikaans is very interesting because there's an Islamic Malay context there, a Malay link, which you'll find fascinating. So all we're saying now is, look, there are 11 official languages in this country. Over the years, an African woman would be judged in a court of law, and she would be addressed in a language that she wouldn't understand. And very often it would lead to injustice. So all we're saying is, let's give indigenous language the status that these other languages have always had. And let's introduce these indigenous languages to schools through legislation. And so they're crying racism. Now they're saying their languages are being marginalized. The languages aren't being marginalized. We're just saying there are other languages in the country. Maybe instruction should be in the mother tongue of indigenous people as well as these other languages. So it is that hysteria of a white genocide and white land grabs that has been fed into there's been a significant shift to the right in world politics over the last 20, 30 years. If you see with the rise of Alternative for Germany, the rise of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and in France, and the Brexit. So there's been a shift towards the right. And so what this very small minority of Afrikaners have done in South Africa is tag onto that trend, claiming white genocide is underway.
How much of it is due to the influence of Elon Musk, who was born in South Africa, grew up in apartheid South Africa?
Right. Well, you know, this is one of the historical amnesia that's being promoted. So Elon Musk, you know, we have to mention these things. Elon Musk is a white male. His father was a white male, and these are the people in charge. They controlled mines, they controlled agriculture, they controlled finance, you know, commerce and industry for 300 years. And then 3 decades ago, Elon Musk and his family, you know, emigrated to Canada because what's happened is as soon as they realize that their privileges are running to an end, they go to where their privileges can continue. So Elon Musk emigrated to Canada, and then he ended up in the United States, and he's become a very wealthy man, but he's kind of retained that white superiority or the white privilege. He's kind of retained that. So in that way, he's attached himself to the whole idea. It's a very complex. It's actually very simple. It's just the whole idea that white people are going to be replaced by dark-skinned others. So it's called the Great Replacement Theory. This Great Replacement Theory so white people in the United States following Donald Trump, because Donald Trump will get rid of the diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right?
Which he's already started.
So it started with that. So that's where Elon Musk comes in, and his money, of course, and X. So he's began to control the narrative through that.
How do you think South Africa should respond to this? The seriousness of the threats coming from the US, the fact that the US is leading the narrative around South Africa and its reverse racism or its oppression to white Afrikaners. How should South Africa, how is South Africa responding? How should it respond on a global stage?
Well, South Africa should continue to stand by its principles, and that is why the International Criminal Court case against Israel is so important, because South Africa has principles of justice and equality, and South Africa will stand by those principles, no matter what. But there is a constant backlash at home from the minority, the white community, who have quite loud voices. You'll find that among my colleagues in the media, there are sort of journalists who, white journalists, I hate to point them out, who've been doing the same thing for 30 or 40 years. So they will write in their columns, quite serious columns, South Africa must be careful or we will lose the West. And the thing is, so when South Africa, it's like, you see the same thing elsewhere.
Well, even in Malaysia, right? Well, you have some voices who say, Malaysia should be careful voicing out these loud support for certain countries, stop alienating the West, right?
I'm glad you raised that. I didn't want to raise it.
I see parallels between the two countries, yes.
Well, the book, I'm here writing a book, and there are so many parallels that it was very disturbing when I found these, when I came across these. I probably shouldn't go into the details because I need to do more research. But one of the problems is, so you have the president would say, go abroad and speak at the UN. And then somebody would say, I don't know why he's going to speak at the UN when there are potholes. And you think to yourself, have you no idea of statecraft? What statecraft's all about? So I've seen the similar things. Why is he talking to other people?
Why is he championing the rights of others when we have many problems domestically? I've heard that too.
So that is so that narrative continues to be peddled through.
Is it a dangerous narrative?
It's not. It's a dangerous narrative, but the thing is, it reproduces the idea that Africans can't govern themselves, and we necessarily mess things up. So since the departure of white people, the country has gone downhill, and very many things have gone wrong in the country. Of course, the economy is bad, crime is incredibly high, gender-based violence is quite serious. Public utilities are in a very bad state. Okay. We sometimes go through days without several days of electricity or running water. So there are very many things going wrong with the country. And the subtext that comes through very many of the reportage is that, it's because the Africans have taken over now. It's the Africans. So there's this surprise that Africans are governing an African country, and that the country would have been better off if it kept the whites in government. So there's a very interesting thing developing so you can, the viewers can see the identify parallels, and I won't say that. So the African National Congress has dominated the first 30 years of democracy in South Africa. Mm-hmm. They've become the home of patronage and effectively ruined the public service over 30 years. And high levels of corruption. We have a former president who has literally more than 700 charges of corruption and money laundering against him. And so they've been losing support. They've been in decline quite seriously, to the extent that last year's election in May, they went down below 50% for the first time. So the home of African nationalism suddenly collapsed. And they've had to go into a coalition government with the former white leaders who were part of the governing elite. So as soon as things start looking better, the narrative that emerges is, yeah, well, it's because whites are back in government again. So these are some of the problems that we have, and it's a very toxic. So in that white narrative is that people always feared South Africa. There was this whole belief that South Africa was sort of the last outpost of Europe's empires, one of the last outposts. Yeah. And so with the departure of the white government, there's panic because we're no longer, quote unquote, aligned with the West.
Yes, so Eurocentrism has been dethroned.
Exactly. The Eurocentrism is not. No, and then so you say that. So I wrote something the other day. It was saying something positive about something that China had done. And so you say something positive that China has done, and then you're lumped with all China's history of good and bad. So it's okay to say something that the United States has done something right. But it's not okay to say that China has done something right. So you're forced into these binaries of good and bad. And for as long as we retain our alliance with the West, it makes that small group of people, very vocal group of people, and who own vast tracts of land, who own and run much of the economy, makes them very sad that we will, quote unquote, lose the West.
Well, as you're describing the history, I cannot help but think that draw the parallels in my head and confuse the fact that sometimes you may be talking about Malaysia or South Africa. It's almost interchangeable in some of the examples that you've given. When we think about where our two countries are in terms of its journey, and in recent years, the strengthening or the realization that the global South has a lot more power and a bigger voice than it once had.
Right.
Where do you see South Africa and Malaysia, for instance, in essentially the
BRICS?
Not just the BRICS, but South Africa and the BRICS, and it being kind of counterweight to Western-led institutions. But in terms of the global South nations and where we are small countries, but middling power, I would say middle power, not middling, middle power, how do we position ourselves in the global South and taking lead? And I see South Africa taking lead, and Malaysia also on the same trajectory. But what's your assessment?
Well, I have... I mentioned, I think I mentioned that I have been really impressed by Anwar Ibrahim's global leadership and increased standing, and it's been quite remarkable. At one point, he reminded me, very specifically, reminded me of President Mandela, when he was saying that we're using under the guise of democracy, some of the worst injustices in the world, and violence is being inflicted upon people in Gaza, and that struck me as something close to Mandela. Now I interviewed Mandela several times. And when I decided to quit journalism to go back to university, in '95. He invited me to work for them for 2 years. So I worked, and I've sort of made very small contributions to some of his speeches, and so I've got a clear sense of what he was like and what he said, and I recognized some of that in Anwar Ibrahim, which was very interesting. But to come back, and I think we need to show intellectual leadership. And that is why South Africa is so important. We can produce intellectual leadership. We know we can. We just need the message to go out there. Now, as an I'm not an independent writer and a columnist, and there are still newspapers that look at what I call little panics. Every newspaper historically, as long as it has a bias, has a prejudice, has a set of prejudices. But there's one media service which has elevated itself as like supremely independent and unbiased. Yet some of us who have looked at the discourse you will see quite clearly where their positions. So you're fighting an internal battle and you're fighting an external battle. So we then, the Global South, have to play this what's called a two-level game. While our prime ministers and presidents go and represent us on global stage, they also have to fight the backlash back home. And how you fight that and how you manage that becomes important. You also have a situation, what I call, what is normal. I wore a shirt, Malaysia football shirt, Harimau Malaya football shirt in South Africa, and somebody said, "Hey, that's a nice shirt." And I sarcastically said, "Well, yeah, I forgot to wear my New York Yankees shirt." And they couldn't get it. Okay. Because, you look around and everybody's wearing the clothing. So we've tied our identity, we've tied our cultures, we've tied the way we see the world through the institutions of the European world. And it's time we reclaimed that. And it's time we said, no, what you call abnormal is normal for us. And this is the kind of, so it's an intellectual change that's needed. We need the discourse to change, and we need intellectual courage among our writers and thinkers and scholars to start saying, we are part of this world, and we want to see a future where we play a role in crafting the multilateral system that governs. And you got to remember, the institutions that were created after the Second World War were all created by the Europeans. The World Trade Organization. The Bretton Woods institutions. Yeah, Bretton Woods created the IMF and World Bank. The World Trade Organization was created by 23 countries. It now has, by the time China or Russia joined in the early 2000s, the rules had already been made. So how do you change that? So that is where we need our politicians to do the work, but our technocrats and our intellectuals to start getting involved in raising the profile and presenting the intellectual weight of the Global South.
Well, thank you so much for sharing some of your insights with me today. I appreciate your time.
You're most welcome.
That was Ismail Hardin wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.